Homeless woman saves millionaire's life, then he falls in love with her. Rain poured relentlessly over the dimly lit alley, turning the pavement into a mirror of glistening puddles. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and discarded waste. Maggie huddled against a rusted dumpster, pulling her tattered coat tighter around her frail body. Her hands, cracked and red from the cold, dug through a worn backpack, her sole possession. Tonight's scavenging had been fruitless, and hunger gnawed at her insides. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure staggering into the alley. A man, tall and sharply dressed, though his polished shoes were now soaked and his neatly combed hair plastered to his forehead. He clutched his chest, his breathing labored, his steps uneven. Maggie froze, watching him collapse to his knees, then crumple face first onto the wet ground. For a moment, she hesitated. People didn't usually collapse in alleyways unless trouble followed close behind. But as the man groaned weakly, her instincts overpowered her caution. She scrambled toward him, her boots splashing through the puddles. "Hey, sir, are you okay?" she shouted, shaking his shoulder. No response. His face was pale, his lips tinged with blue. Maggie recognized the signs immediately. She'd seen enough people on the streets suffer from heart attacks or overdoses. Panic surged through her. "Stay with me, okay? You're not dying on my watch." Maggie pressed her ear to his chest, her unkempt hair falling over his damp suit. His heartbeat was faint, erratic. Desperately, she began CPR, her palms pressing firmly against his chest in rhythm. "Come on, breathe," she yelled, her voice cracking. "Don't you dare leave me here." Her mind raced as she continued compressions. How long had it been? A minute? 2? She could feel the burn in her arms, but she refused to stop. "Somebody help," she screamed into the alley, her voice swallowed by the rain and distant city noise. "Please, someone call an ambulance." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man gasped, his chest heaving as air flooded his lungs. Maggie sat back on her heels, her hands trembling. "Thank God," she muttered, brushing wet strands of hair out of her face. The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. He tried to speak but only managed a weak groan. Maggie leaned closer. "Hey, you're okay now. Just hold on. Help is coming," she said softly, though she had no idea if help would arrive in time. As if summoned by her words, the faint wail of sirens echoed through the alley. Maggie looked up, her heart pounding with relief. She gently patted the man's shoulder. "You're going to be fine," she whispered. "Just hang in there." Moments later, paramedics rushed into the scene, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They worked quickly, lifting the man onto a stretcher. One of them turned to Maggie. "Did you perform CPR?" he asked. She nodded silently, feeling suddenly self-conscious. Her soaked coat and disheveled appearance couldn't have painted a starker contrast to the pristine uniforms of the medics. "You saved his life," the paramedic said, his voice tinged with admiration. Maggie blinked, unsure how to respond. Before she could process his words, the ambulance doors slammed shut, and the vehicle sped away, its red lights vanishing into the night. For a long moment, Maggie stood there, alone in the rain, her breath visible in the cold air. She glanced down at her trembling hands, the realization sinking in. She had saved a life tonight. But as the adrenaline faded, so did the brief warmth of accomplishment. Her stomach growled, and the icy rain seeped deeper into her clothes. Life on the streets didn't pause for heroics. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Edward stirred, his eyelids fluttering open to the sterile white ceiling. His body felt heavy, his chest sore. He turned his head slightly, taking in the room, a private suite, luxurious by hospital standards. Of course, it would be. Money solved problems before they even arose. A nurse entered, her smile professional yet distant. "Good morning, Mr. Roth. You had quite the scare," she said, checking his vitals. "What happened?" Edward rasped, his voice hoarse. "You suffered a heart attack. If it weren't for a good Samaritan who performed CPR, you might not have made it." She paused, her tone softening. "She saved your life." Edward frowned, his mind foggy. "A good Samaritan? The last thing he remembered was clutching his chest as pain exploded through him. He'd stumbled into the alley behind his office building, too disoriented to call for help. "Who was she?" he asked. The nurse shook her head. "I'm afraid I don't know. She left before we could get her information." Edward leaned back against the pillows, his thoughts swirling. A stranger had saved him. A woman, the nurse had said. The image of the rain-soaked alley flashed in his mind, though it was blurry and disjointed. Who was she? Why had she helped him? And why had she disappeared? Days later, Edward sat in his sprawling office, the skyline of the city stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The heart attack had been a wake-up call, though not in the way his doctors had intended. They spoke of diet changes and exercise, of reducing stress. But Edward's thoughts were consumed by the woman who had saved him. He had spent his entire life focused on building his empire. Every hour was accounted for, every decision calculated. Acts of kindness weren't part of his world, at least not without strings attached. Yet this stranger had risked her safety, her time, to save him without expecting anything in return. He glanced at the sketch on his desk. It had been found in the alley after the incident, likely dropped by the woman in her hurry to leave. The pencil lines were rough but skilled, capturing the faint outline of his face. It was imperfect yet hauntingly beautiful. Edward ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling within him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond his business ventures. He needed to find her, not just to thank her, but to understand why she had done what she did. "Call the private investigator," he told his assistant. "I need someone found." Meanwhile, Maggie sat on the edge of her makeshift bed, a collection of worn blankets and cardboard tucked beneath an overpass. The city roared above her, indifferent to her existence. She stared at her sketchbook, her fingers tracing the outline of the drawing she had made that night. She hadn't meant to leave it behind, but in the chaos, it had slipped from her grasp. It wasn't just a sketch. It was a glimpse into her soul, a part of her she rarely shared. Art had once been her life, her passion. Before everything fell apart, before the gallery she worked at shuttered its doors, before her landlord evicted her, before she became just another invisible face in the crowd. Maggie closed her eyes, the memories flooding back. She had been someone once. Someone with dreams, with a future. But the streets had a way of stripping you down to the barest version of yourself. Survival became the only goal. Still, saving that man had stirred something within her. A flicker of the person she used to be. It was foolish, she knew, but she couldn't help but wonder what had happened to him. Was he okay? Did he even remember her? Maggie shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. It didn't matter. Life moved on, whether you were ready or not. Edward paced his penthouse apartment, frustration etched across his face. The private investigator had hit roadblocks. No name, no address, the man had said over the phone. She vanished after the ambulance left. Edward clenched his fists. How could someone who had such a profound impact on his life simply disappear? The sketch on his desk caught his eye again. He picked it up, studying the lines with renewed intensity. Every stroke told a story of care, of observation, of someone who had seen him in his most vulnerable moment and still cared enough to capture it. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a connection. Edward made a decision. If the investigator couldn't find her, he would. For the first time in years, he stepped away from his carefully curated life of luxury and dove into the unknown. Maggie sat quietly in the corner of a community shelter, her fingers deftly working to create another sketch. This one depicted a small child playing in a park, his laughter frozen in pencil lines. Drawing was her escape, a way to hold on to beauty in a world that often seemed devoid of it. "That's beautiful," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Maggie looked up to see a young woman, her face kind but weary, holding a tray of food. "You should sell those. People would love them." Maggie forced a small smile. "Thanks," she replied softly, her gaze returning to the sketch. Selling her art had once been her dream, but now it felt like a distant memory. Survival came first. As the shelter buzzed with the usual activity, families gathering for meals, volunteers distributing supplies, Maggie couldn't shake the lingering thoughts of the man she had saved. She had tried to forget, to move on, but something about him stuck with her. Perhaps it was the vulnerability in his eyes, or the way he had fought to breathe as she performed CPR. For a brief moment, they had shared something profound, something that connected them beyond words. Edward's search led him to places he had never thought to go. Shelters, soup kitchens, and parks, worlds that existed parallel to his own but felt like a different universe. He was struck by the stark contrast between his life and the lives of those he encountered. A man in a tailored suit walking into a homeless shelter drew stares, some curious, others wary. He approached volunteers, showing them the sketch. "Have you seen her? I need to find her." One older man squinted at the paper, his weathered face thoughtful. "Looks familiar," he said, scratching his chin. "Think I've seen her down by the river, near the old bridge. She's got a knack for drawing, doesn't she?" Edward's heart raced. Finally, a lead. The sun was setting as Edward approached the bridge, its rusted frame casting long shadows over the water below. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. He spotted her from a distance, Maggie, sitting cross-legged on a patch of concrete, her sketchbook resting on her lap. For a moment he hesitated. What could he possibly say to her? How could he convey the gratitude and curiosity that had consumed him since that night? Taking a deep breath, he approached. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Maggie looked up, startled. Her eyes darted to his face, then to his tailored coat, before recognition flickered across her features. "It's you," she said softly, her tone a mix of surprise and apprehension. Edward nodded, unsure how to begin. "I've been looking for you," he said. "You saved my life. I needed to thank you." Maggie's expression hardened slightly. "You don't owe me anything," she replied, her voice tinged with defensiveness. "I did what anyone would have done." "Not everyone would have," Edward countered. "You didn't have to stop. You didn't have to stay." There was a pause as they studied each other, the weight of their shared moment hanging between them. Finally, Edward extended his hand. "My name is Edward Roth." Maggie hesitated before shaking his hand. "Maggie," she said simply. Edward glanced at her sketchbook, catching a glimpse of her latest drawing. "You're talented," he said, his tone sincere. "Really talented?" Maggie shrugged, closing the book. "It's just something I do to pass the time." "It's more than that," Edward insisted. "Your art, it's incredible. You shouldn't be out here." Maggie stiffened, her walls going up. "What do you know about being out here?" she snapped. "You think I chose this?" "No," Edward said quickly, his voice steady. "I'm not here to judge. I'm here because I owe you my life. And I want to help." "I don't need your help," Maggie replied, her voice sharp but laced with vulnerability. Edward took a step back, sensing her discomfort. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But I'd still like to. If you'll let me." Over the next few weeks, Edward kept his word. He didn't offer Maggie charity. He knew she wouldn't accept it. Instead, he found small, meaningful ways to support her. He purchased several of her sketches anonymously, ensuring she had enough money for food and supplies. He arranged for an art dealer friend to discover her work, presenting it as if it had been found by chance. Maggie was skeptical at first, but as her art began to sell and her confidence grew, she allowed herself to hope again. For the first time in years, she began to imagine a future beyond survival. Their interactions grew more frequent, their conversations deeper. Edward learned about Maggie's past, her dreams, her losses, her resilience. And Maggie, in turn, saw a side of Edward that few knew existed. Beneath his polished exterior was a man searching for meaning, for connection, for redemption. But as their bond deepened, so did the unspoken tension between them. Maggie couldn't help but wonder why Edward cared so much. And Edward couldn't ignore the growing realization that his gratitude had evolved into something more. One crisp autumn evening, Edward and Maggie sat on a park bench overlooking the river. The air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, and the sky was streaked with shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. Maggie held her sketchbook, idly drawing the skyline, while Edward watched her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You know," Edward began, breaking the comfortable silence, I don't think I've ever met anyone quite like you. Maggie glanced at him, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. Is that supposed to be a compliment? Edward chuckled softly. It is. You've been through so much and yet here you are. So talented. It's remarkable. Maggie shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. I don't feel remarkable. Most days I'm just trying to get by. That's what makes you remarkable, Edward said, his tone earnest. Most people wouldn't have stopped that night. Most people wouldn't have done what you did. Maggie's smile faded slightly, and she returned her focus to her sketch. I don't really think about it that way. I couldn't walk away. That's all. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the city. Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You know, he said softly, I've been thinking a lot about my life since that night. About what really matters. Maggie looked at him, her expression curious but guarded. And what did you figure out? Edward exhaled deeply, his gaze fixed on the river. That I've spent so much time chasing success, money, power, but none of it feels real. None of it feels like it matters. Not in the way that night mattered. Maggie closed her sketchbook, turning her full attention to him. So what does matter, then? He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. People. Connection. Making a difference. I spent my whole life thinking I could buy happiness, but I've realized it's the things you can't buy that mean the most. Maggie studied him for a moment, her defenses softening. That's a nice sentiment, she said quietly. But what are you going to do about it? Edward smiled faintly, a spark of determination in his eyes. I don't know yet, but I know it starts with you. Maggie blinked, caught off guard. Me? Yes, Edward said firmly. You reminded me of what it means to care about someone else. To see someone not as a transaction or a means to an end, but as a person. I want to help you, Maggie. Not because I feel obligated, but because I want to. Maggie's heart twisted at his words, a mix of hope and fear bubbling inside her. She wanted to believe him, but years of disappointment and hardship made trust a fragile thing. I appreciate that, Edward, she said carefully. But I don't want to be anyone's charity case. You're not, Edward said quickly. This isn't about charity. It's about partnership. You have a gift, Maggie. Your art, it's extraordinary. And the world deserves to see it. Maggie's gaze dropped to her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of her sketchbook. I don't know if I'm ready for that, she admitted. It's been so long since I believed in myself. Edward reached over, his hand resting gently on hers. Then let me believe in you until you can. The following months brought changes neither of them could have predicted. Edward continued to support Maggie's art in subtle, unobtrusive ways. He introduced her to gallery owners and art collectors, always framing it as if her talent had simply been discovered by chance. Slowly but surely, Maggie's work began to gain attention. Her first gallery show was a modest affair, held in a small but charming venue downtown. Maggie had been reluctant to agree to it, but Edward's quiet encouragement had finally won her over. The night of the opening, she stood nervously in the corner, watching as visitors admired her pieces. Edward arrived late, slipping in quietly so as not to draw attention. He found her standing alone, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. How's it going? He asked, his voice low. Maggie turned to him, her eyes wide with a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. They're looking at my work. They like it? Edward smiled warmly. Of course they do. You're brilliant, Maggie. I've been telling you that all along. She gave him a small, shy smile, her cheeks flushing slightly. I couldn't have done this without you, she admitted. Thank you, Edward. For everything. Edward's smile softened, and he took a step closer. You did this, Maggie. All I did was open a door. You walked through it. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the noise of the gallery faded away. Maggie felt her heart race, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. She quickly looked away, breaking the moment. I should go check on the guests, she said, her voice hurried. Edward nodded, his expression unreadable. Of course. I'll be here if you need me. As Maggie's career began to take off, her bond with Edward deepened. They spent more time together, their conversations ranging from light-hearted banter to deep, vulnerable admissions. Maggie found herself laughing more, dreaming more, and, for the first time in a long time, hoping more. But with hope came fear. Maggie couldn't shake the nagging doubt that this new life was too good to be true. She had spent so long bracing for disappointment that the idea of genuine happiness felt foreign, almost dangerous. One evening, as they walked through the park, Edward noticed her silence. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked. Maggie hesitated, her gaze fixed on the ground. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," she admitted. "Like this is all going to fall apart." Edward stopped walking, turning to face her. "Maggie," he said gently, "this isn't going to fall apart. I'm not going anywhere." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You can't promise that," she whispered. "People always leave. Things always go wrong." Edward stepped closer, his voice firm but kind. "I know you've been let down before. I know you've been hurt. But I'm not those people. I'm here because I want to be. Because I care about you." Maggie's defenses crumbled, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "I'm scared, Edward," she admitted. "I'm scared of trusting this. Of trusting you." Edward reached out, gently wiping the tear from her cheek. "I know," he said softly, "but you don't have to do this alone. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Maggie nodded, her heart aching with a mix of fear and longing. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The days that followed were some of the brightest Maggie could remember. Her artwork began to sell more frequently, and galleries started reaching out to her for potential exhibits. Her name, once whispered among street artists and shelter friends, was now spoken in circles she never dreamed of joining. Edward was there for every step, quietly cheering her on. His support never felt overbearing, never like charity. It felt genuine. And as Maggie's confidence grew, so did her feelings for him, a terrifying prospect. One crisp winter evening, they found themselves at Maggie's tiny apartment. Though it wasn't much, it was hers. A studio with chipped paint, a single window overlooking the city, and a small corner dedicated to her art supplies. Maggie had invited Edward over to show him her latest work, a series inspired by her time on the streets. "This one," she said, gesturing to a painting of a lone figure curled up beneath an overpass, "is probably the most personal." Edward studied it carefully, his expression thoughtful. "It's haunting," he said finally, "and beautiful. Just like your work always is." Maggie smiled faintly, her arms crossed over her chest. "It's hard to look at sometimes. It brings back everything. But I think it's important." Edward turned to her, his gaze soft. "It is. You're giving a voice to something most people would rather ignore. That takes courage." Maggie shrugged, her smile faltering. "It doesn't always feel like courage. Sometimes it just feels like dragging up old wounds." "Old wounds are where the light gets in," Edward said gently. "At least, that's what I've learned." Maggie met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. For a moment, the air seemed to still, the hum of the city outside fading into the background. She looked away quickly, breaking the spell. "I'll get us some tea," she mumbled, disappearing into the tiny kitchenette. Edward watched her go, a mixture of admiration and longing tightening his chest. He wanted to tell her how he felt, but something held him back. Maggie was like a fragile masterpiece, beautiful, resilient, but wary of being mishandled. He didn't want to risk breaking what they had built. As the weeks turned into months, their bond deepened in ways neither of them fully understood. Edward found himself looking forward to their late-night talks, their quiet walks, and the moments of laughter that came so easily when he was with her. And Maggie, for the first time in years, felt like she had found someone she could trust. But fear lingered in the corners of her mind. She couldn't shake the thought that she and Edward came from two different worlds, worlds that weren't meant to overlap. He was a millionaire with a penthouse and a boardroom. She was a former homeless artist trying to find her place in the world. How could this possibly work? That fear came to a head one evening at an upscale gallery event. Edward had convinced Maggie to showcase her latest collection at a prominent venue, and the turnout had been overwhelming. Wealthy patrons milled about, admiring her pieces, while Maggie stood to the side, feeling out of place in a borrowed dress. "You should mingle," Edward said, appearing at her side with a glass of champagne. "These people are here for you." Maggie shook her head, her hands fidgeting nervously. "I don't belong here, Edward. Look at them, they're not like me." "You're wrong," Edward said firmly. "They're here because of your talent. Because they see what I see." Maggie glanced at him, her expression uncertain. "And what's that?" Edward hesitated, his heart pounding. He wanted to tell her everything, that he admired her, that he cared for her, that she had changed his life in ways he couldn't put into words. But before he could speak, a patron approached, interrupting the moment. "Miss, your work is phenomenal," the man said, shaking her hand. "I'd like to discuss a potential commission." Maggie forced a smile, nodding politely, but her mind was elsewhere. As the man walked away, she turned back to Edward, but the moment had passed. That night, as Edward drove her home, the silence in the car was heavy. Maggie stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. Finally, she spoke. "Why are you doing all of this?" she asked quietly. Edward glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "All of this," Maggie said, gesturing vaguely. "The gallery shows, the connections, the support. Why do you care so much?" Edward hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because you deserve it," he said finally. "Because I believe in you." Maggie turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "It's more than that," she said softly. "Isn't it?" Edward tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his heart racing. "Yes," he admitted. "It's more than that." Maggie looked away, her emotions a tangled mess. She felt something for Edward, something real, but the fear of letting herself be vulnerable again was almost paralyzing. As the car pulled up to her building, Edward turned to her, his expression earnest. "Maggie, Good night, Edward," she said quickly, cutting him off. She opened the door and stepped out, leaving him sitting there, his words unspoken. The following days were a blur of confusion and tension for Maggie. Her feelings for Edward were undeniable, but so were her fears. She had built walls around her heart for years, and now someone was asking to tear them down. Could she let him in? Could she trust him not to hurt her? Edward, meanwhile, wrestled with his own doubts. He wanted to be patient, to give Maggie the space she needed. But every moment spent apart felt like a missed opportunity, a chance to tell her how much she meant to him slipping away. It wasn't until a chance encounter at the park that the dam finally broke. Maggie was sitting on their usual bench, sketching the skyline, when Edward appeared, his coat flapping in the wind. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm but gentle. Maggie looked up at him, her heart pounding. "Edward, No," he interrupted, sitting beside her. "Let me say this." She closed her sketchbook, her hands trembling slightly. "I care about you, Maggie," Edward said, his eyes locked on hers. "More than I've cared about anyone in a long time. You've changed my life in ways I didn't even know I needed. And I know we come from different worlds, but that doesn't matter to me. What matters is you." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, her defenses crumbling. "Edward, I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of trusting this. Of trusting you." Edward reached out, taking her hands in his. "I know," he said softly. "But you don't have to be scared. I'm here, Maggie. I'm not going anywhere." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, happiness wasn't a dream. It was real. And it was right here. The weeks following their heartfelt conversation brought a new kind of closeness between Maggie and Edward. For the first time, they began to navigate the blurred lines of their relationship, letting their guards down and allowing themselves to explore what could be. Their worlds, though different, began to intertwine in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Maggie's art career continued to flourish. With Edward's support, her pieces were showcased in larger galleries, attracting more attention from critics and collectors alike. She poured her soul into her work, capturing scenes from her past and the lives of those she had shared the streets with. Each piece told a story of resilience, hope, and survival. At the same time, Edward began making changes in his own life. Inspired by Maggie, He used his wealth and influence to fund programs for the homeless, creating shelters and job training initiatives. His colleagues noticed the shift in him. Gone was the detached, work-obsessed businessman. In his place was a man driven by purpose and compassion. One evening, as they walked hand in hand through the park, Maggie glanced at Edward, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she began, "I used to think people like you couldn't understand what it's like to lose everything." Edward looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "And now I think you've lost things too," Maggie said softly. "Maybe not the same way I did, but loss is loss." Edward nodded, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "I lost myself, Maggie," he admitted. "Somewhere along the way, I got so caught up in chasing success that I forgot what really mattered. Meeting you, it woke me up." Maggie smiled faintly, her fingers tightening around his. "You've changed my life too," she said. "In ways I never thought possible." They stopped walking, and Edward turned to face her. "Maggie," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I don't want this to just be a chapter in our lives. I want this to be the whole story." Maggie's heart raced as she searched his eyes, seeing nothing but sincerity. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying I love you," Edward said, his voice steady. "And I want to build a life with you, a real life, together." Maggie felt tears prick her eyes as she took in his words. For so long, she had believed that love was something out of reach, a luxury she couldn't afford. But here it was, standing before her, offering her a future she never dared to dream of. "I love you too," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'm scared, Edward. What if this doesn't work? What if I mess it up?" Edward cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. "We'll figure it out together," he said. "No matter what." Maggie smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with a mix of fear and joy. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Their life together was far from perfect, but it was real. They faced challenges, from skeptical acquaintances to Maggie's lingering insecurities, but they tackled each one head-on, leaning on each other for strength. Edward's initiatives for the homeless grew into a full-fledged foundation, providing housing, mental health services, and job opportunities. Maggie became a voice for the voiceless, using her art to raise awareness and funds for the cause. One evening, as they prepared for the grand opening of a new shelter funded by Edward's foundation, Maggie stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple yet elegant dress Edward had picked out for her. She still wasn't used to events like this, but she had learned to carry herself with quiet confidence. Edward appeared behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes warm. Maggie turned to face him, her smile soft. "And you look nervous," she teased. Edward chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "I am. This shelter, it's the biggest project we've done yet. I just want it to be perfect." "It will be," Maggie said firmly, "because you've poured your heart into it. And because you care." Edward kissed her forehead, his tension easing. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said. "You've changed everything, Maggie." Maggie's eyes glistened with emotion as she placed a hand on his cheek. "We changed each other," she said softly. The shelter opening was a resounding success. As Edward addressed the crowd, thanking donors and volunteers, Maggie stood to the side, her heart swelling with pride. She watched as he spoke with passion and conviction, his words resonating with everyone in the room. When it was Maggie's turn to speak, she stepped up to the podium, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the audience. "I spent years feeling invisible," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "But Edward saw me. He believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. And because of that, I found my voice again." She paused, her eyes meeting Edward's. "This shelter isn't just about providing a roof over someone's head. It's about giving people hope. It's about showing them that they matter. And that's something I'll never stop fighting for." The room erupted in applause, and as Maggie stepped down, Edward pulled her into a tight embrace. "You were incredible," he whispered. "So were you," she replied, her smile radiant. In the months that followed, their lives continued to flourish. Maggie's art became a beacon of hope for those who had walked the same difficult path she had, and Edward's foundation transformed countless lives. Together, they built not just a life, but a legacy, one rooted in compassion, resilience, and love. One quiet evening, as they sat together on the balcony of Edward's penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle below, Maggie leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked softly. "All the time," Edward replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "It changed everything." Maggie smiled, her fingers intertwining with his. "Me too. I used to think I was saving your life that night. But maybe you saved mine too." Edward kissed her temple, his heart full. "We saved each other," he said. "And that's the best kind of love there is." Maggie and Edward's life together was blossoming, but as with any journey, there were trials that tested their bond and individual growth. The transition from the streets to her modest apartment, and now to a world where she was recognized as a celebrated artist, left Maggie feeling unmoored at times. She found herself grappling with imposter syndrome, questioning whether she deserved the success she had stumbled into. Late at night, when Edward was asleep or away at meetings, she would sit by her window and stare out at the city that had once been her adversary. "I don't belong here," she whispered to herself one evening, clutching her sketchbook as if it could anchor her to reality. Her mind wandered to the people she had left behind, faces etched with hardship, some who hadn't been as lucky as she had. Guilt gnawed at her. Edward noticed the shadows that sometimes lingered in her eyes. He approached her gently one night, setting down 2 steaming cups of tea on the small table by the window. "You're far away again," he said softly. Maggie forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just thinking about the past?" Edward asked, sitting beside her. She nodded. "And the people who are still out there. I feel like I left them behind." Edward reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You haven't left them behind. Look at everything you're doing. Your work is giving them a voice, and the foundation is helping them in ways that wouldn't have been possible otherwise." Maggie sighed. "I know, but it doesn't feel like enough. I want to do more." Edward's gaze softened. "Then let's do more. Together." Inspired by Maggie's determination, they decided to create a program within Edward's foundation, focused on fostering creativity among those experiencing homelessness. They called it Second Chances, and it aimed to provide art supplies, workshops, and exhibition opportunities for people like Maggie, those with untapped talent and untold stories. Maggie took the lead, spending her days at shelters and community centers, encouraging others to express themselves through art. She met people who reminded her of herself, wary, bruised by life, but still holding onto a flicker of hope. One man, an elderly veteran named Sam, caught her attention. His hands trembled as he sketched, the lines shaky but filled with raw emotion. Maggie sat beside him during one workshop, watching as he worked on a portrait of what appeared to be a young boy. "Who's that?" she asked gently. Sam paused, his eyes misty. "My grandson. Haven't seen him in years. Don't even know if he'd recognize me." Maggie's heart ached for him. "You should try to reconnect," she said. "It's never too late." Sam shook his head, his expression clouded with doubt. "It's not that simple." Maggie nodded, understanding the weight of unspoken wounds. "Maybe not. But sometimes, all it takes is one small step." As weeks passed, Maggie saw a change in Sam and others who participated in the program. The act of creating gave them a sense of purpose, a reminder that their lives held value beyond their circumstances. Meanwhile, Edward faced his own challenges. The board of his company had grown restless, questioning his recent shift in focus. Shareholders were concerned that his philanthropic efforts were distracting him from the company's bottom line. "You've been pouring resources into this foundation," one board member said during a tense meeting. "But what about the company? What about our profits?" Edward's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "The company is doing well, and I'm proud of the foundation's impact. This isn't just about money, it's about making a difference." The room buzzed with murmurs, some supportive, others skeptical. Edward knew he was walking a fine line, but he refused to compromise his newfound purpose. Later that evening, he confided in Maggie. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing," he admitted. "The board thinks I'm too distracted, and maybe they're right." Maggie placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "You are doing the right thing, Edward. Don't let them make you doubt that. You've changed so many lives, mine included." He smiled, her words steadying him. "I guess we'll just have to prove them wrong." Their relationship continued to deepen, but with it came moments of vulnerability. One evening, while sorting through some of her old sketches, Maggie came across a drawing she had made during her hardest days on the streets. It depicted a younger version of herself, huddled beneath an overpass, her expression weary but defiant. Edward entered the room and saw the sketch in her hands. "That's powerful," he said, sitting beside her. Maggie stared at it for a long moment before speaking. "Sometimes I still feel like that girl. Like I'm one step away from losing everything again." Edward wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "You're not that girl anymore, Maggie. You've built something incredible. And even if you ever stumble, I'll be right here to catch you." Tears welled in her eyes as she leaned into him, grateful for his unwavering support. As the years passed, Maggie and Edward's bond only grew stronger. They celebrated milestones together: Maggie's first solo gallery show in a major city, the expansion of Edward's foundation to multiple states, and even small victories like hosting their first holiday dinner in their shared home. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during an anniversary of the night they first met. Edward had planned a quiet evening for the two of them, recreating the meal they had shared at a small diner after one of Maggie's early art shows. As they sat at the candlelit table, Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Maggie's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a simple but elegant ring. "Maggie," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you changed my life in ways I can't even begin to describe. You taught me how to see the world differently, how to care, how to love. I can't imagine my life without you in it. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Maggie's face as she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." Edward slipped the ring onto her finger, his own eyes misty with happiness. They embraced, their love a testament to the power of second chances. The story of Maggie and Edward didn't end with their engagement. It continued to unfold in ways that inspired everyone around them. Their marriage was a celebration of love and resilience, attended by friends, family, and many of the people whose lives they had touched through their foundation. Together, they built not just a life but a legacy, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of light. Their journey, from an alley on a rainy night to a life filled with purpose and love, became a story of hope for all who heard it. Maggie's engagement to Edward was the talk of their circles. While those closest to them celebrated their love story as a triumph, the union wasn't without its critics. Gossip columns whispered about the homeless woman turned millionaire's fiancé, and business pundits questioned Edward's priorities, framing their relationship as a distraction from his corporate responsibilities. Maggie did her best to ignore the whispers, but late at night, when she was alone with her thoughts, the doubts crept in. Was she really enough for Edward? Could she navigate this new world without losing herself? Edward sensed her unease one evening as they sat together in their living room. Maggie was sketching, her strokes more erratic than usual. "What's wrong?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then set her pencil down. "Sometimes I feel like I don't belong in your world," she admitted. "Like I'm an outsider trying to fit into something that wasn't made for me." Edward reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Maggie, you're not an outsider. You're my partner. This world isn't just mine anymore, it's ours. And if anyone can't see that, then they don't belong in it." Maggie smiled faintly, his words a balm to her worries. "It's just hard sometimes," she said. "I spent so many years being invisible, and now, it feels like the whole world is watching." "Let them watch," Edward said with a grin. "Because what they're seeing is someone incredible." Despite the challenges, Maggie threw herself into her art and her work with the foundation. She spearheaded a new initiative called Art Heals, a traveling exhibition that showcased the work of people experiencing homelessness. Each piece told a story, giving a voice to those who had been silenced by their circumstances. One of the exhibition's most powerful moments came when Sam, the veteran she had met at the workshop, displayed a portrait of his grandson. The piece was raw and emotional, capturing the longing and regret that had shaped his years apart from his family. At the opening of the exhibit, Maggie introduced Sam to the audience. "This is more than art," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is a chance to reconnect, to heal, to hope." As the crowd applauded, Sam approached Maggie, his eyes brimming with tears. "I called him," he said quietly. "My grandson. I took your advice and I called him." Maggie's heart swelled. "And? He wants to see me," Sam said, his voice cracking. "After all these years, he wants to see me." Maggie hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "That's amazing, Sam. I'm so happy for you." Moments like these reminded Maggie why she had chosen this path. It wasn't just about her art or her success, it was about making a difference. Meanwhile, Edward faced mounting pressure from his corporate board. The foundation's rapid growth had drawn resources and attention away from the company's core operations, leading to tension among the shareholders. During one particularly heated board meeting, Edward stood his ground. "This company has more than enough to succeed," he said firmly. "And if some of our profits are being used to help people, then that's something to be proud of." One board member, a sharp-tongued woman named Eleanor, crossed her arms. "Pride doesn't pay dividends, Edward." "No, but it builds something far more valuable," Edward shot back. "A legacy. And if anyone here can't see that, then maybe you're in the wrong room." The tension was palpable, but Edward's conviction was unwavering. He left the meeting feeling both drained and invigorated, more determined than ever to balance his business and philanthropic efforts. That evening, he confided in Maggie. "Sometimes I feel like I'm fighting two battles," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "One for the company and one for the foundation." Maggie placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You're not fighting alone," she said. "We're in this together." As their wedding day approached, Maggie and Edward faced one final challenge, a surprise visit from Edward's estranged sister, Clara. They hadn't spoken in years, their relationship fractured by a series of misunderstandings and disagreements. Clara arrived unannounced one afternoon, her expression guarded as she stepped into their home. "I heard you're getting married," she said, her tone neutral. Edward's surprise quickly gave way to cautious optimism. "Clara," he said warmly, "it's good to see you." Clara's gaze shifted to Maggie, who stood nearby, her expression equally uncertain. "You must be the one who turned my brother into a philanthropist," Clara said with a faint smile. Maggie extended her hand. "I'm Maggie," she said. "It's nice to meet you." Over the course of the afternoon, Clara's icy demeanor thawed as she saw the positive changes in Edward's life. By the time she left, she and Edward had begun to rebuild their relationship, and she had even extended an olive branch to Maggie. "I'll see you at the wedding," Clara said before leaving. "And for what it's worth, I think you're good for him." The wedding day was a celebration of love, resilience, and new beginnings. Held in a small, picturesque garden, the ceremony was intimate yet elegant, attended by friends, family, and many of the people whose lives Maggie and Edward had touched. As Maggie walked down the aisle, her heart swelled with gratitude. She had once believed that happiness was out of reach, that love and stability were things other people got to have. But here she was, surrounded by people who believed in her, walking toward the man who had shown her that she was worth believing in. When they exchanged vows, Edward's voice was steady but filled with emotion. "Maggie, you've taught me how to see the world differently, how to care deeply, and how to love fully. I promise to stand by you, to believe in you, and to build a life with you that's filled with purpose and joy." Maggie's voice trembled as she replied, "Edward, you saw me when I thought I was invisible. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. I promise to love you, to stand by you, and to create a future with you that's filled with hope." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, the crowd erupted into applause, and Maggie felt a sense of peace she had never known. Their journey continued, filled with moments of growth, challenge, and triumph. Together, they proved that love could bridge even the widest gaps, and that second chances weren't just possible, they were transformative. Maggie and Edward's story became a beacon of hope for others, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of light. And as they built their life together, They carried that light forward, illuminating the lives of everyone they touched.